Do you have questions? Last time we were speaking about the territorial violations committed by Hitler, and we saw the first major territorial violation, that is the Austrian Anschluss, and also the consequences. We now will examine today probably the two next moves, which will be concentrated on Czechoslovakia, because Czechoslovakia was, even in his Mein Kampf and also in this meeting he had with his close advisors, Czechoslovakia was the first target he was aiming at, and it changed only because Schuschnigg's initiative to wanting to see him in March made him change the sequence of his violations. He took Austria first. Now, yes?
Why did he want to do Czechoslovakia first? Wouldn't it have made more sense geographically to go through Austria anyway?
Yes, but I think very often in Hitler's behavior, people underrate the irrationality. That is his basic, I was nearly going to say his basic instincts, his basic emotional hatred. He had a great emotional hatred for the Czechs, even though ultimately the Czechs fared in World War I, in World War II, much better than the Poles, for which he had sympathy. The Poles fared extremely badly, simply because a new element came in. When the Poles dared to contradict him, to resist him, he got carried away and he would have no mercy for them. But you raised the question, as Austria has had with Czechoslovakia the same as Russia with Poland or Russia with Hungary, a traditional century-old antagonism, essentially in terms of one oppressing the other. For Austria, it goes back even to the beginning of the 30 Years' War, when the Austrian Imperial Army in 1618, when they crushed the Czech army at the Battle of the so-called White Mountain, and when in the aftermath of this defeat, where the Czechs suffered tremendous losses, the Austrians even managed then to arrest the Czech noble leaders, have them condemned to death and officially hanged in Prague. That this kind of an how should I say, of an emotional antagonism never disappeared. Now let's have a look. We have divided up, as we look back on those events from hindsight, we have divided up this in two distinct moves. The first one, which has become known under the name of the Munich Conference of September 28th, 29th, 1938, and Munich has become, in that sense, a byword for concessions to the dictator, for appeasement, for surrender, for cowardice on the part of the Western democracies. Now, let's have a look now to see how this materialized. I will proceed again the same way as I did for Austria, which were the origins, which were the events, and which will be the consequences. First, the origins. Well, the origins, we will have to go back to what Hitler had said in his Mein Kampf, that he meant, before he would begin the conquest of the living space, to first realize the preliminaries, and that was the destruction of Czechoslovakia and the annexation of Austria. Now, the Austrian annexation was already now achieved. Immediately, despite the fact, and Hitler was always good in lying. Remember what I said earlier. He would, for him, lying or not lying, that was just a matter of convenience. Goering, when he practically was in the process of carrying out the annexation of Austria, Goering had reassured the Czechs that they had nothing to fear. Because if the Czechs had acted at that moment, and if they had been able to carry along with them the French, the Germans would have been in trouble. Because the Czech army was a strong, efficient army. But of course, the French were in no mood to do something. So Goering had lied to the Czechs, telling them that they should not worry about anything. There were not even 10 days over. Then Hitler already prepared for his next move. That is to start what he considered should be the destruction of Czechoslovakia. He acted on 3 levels. First of all, the level of military preparation. He gave the order to the German army to be ready to invade Czechoslovakia in the foreseeable future. He did not give a precise date because, after all, the Czech army was strong and the German army was not yet that strong. So the German generals, they started moving out their military plans for the occupation, for the invasion of Czechoslovakia. And of course, these preparations, these military preparations, could not remain totally secret, because every other country had their own intelligence, covering also Germany. In other words, being informed about what was going on. Military level. Second, the propaganda, the publicity level. Hitler, the German, and particularly Goebbels, the Minister of Propaganda, the Germans were reporting now on a regular basis incidents of oppression of the German minority. Remember, they lived in Czechoslovakia, in the area, in the neighbor area with Germany, that is to the north and to the northwest, in the mountainous area which is called the Sudeten. Sudeten, you spell it capital S-U-D-E-T-E-N. In this Sudeten area lived 3.5 million German-speaking people who had expected after World War I that they would be allowed to join Germany. But the peacemakers in Versailles had forbidden this.
My question is, even though Hitler told them that they didn't have to worry about being invaded, if they had their own intelligence, why didn't they, and they realized that he was building up his army, why didn't they counteract it and build up their own?
But you know, once the events were over, once Austria did not exist, they could not two weeks later begin now all of a sudden militarily reacting. You know, when you miss the right opportunity to react, you'll stay quiet and wait what will come next. And so in that sense, of course, they were also taken by surprise. This whole Austrian venture was a surprise initiative of Hitler's. But Goebbels now, there was practically no day when in the German press, on the German radio, there were reports about examples where the Czech government arrested the Germans, oppressed them, did not allow them the same rights, and so on. So in other words, the German public opinion and also world public opinion was practically prepared that tension was rising and that something would happen in the foreseeable future. In that sense, Hitler prepared for what he meant to do. And there was a third level. That was the political level inside Czechoslovakia itself. Because inside Czechoslovakia, I told you that the Czech state, or I should say the Czechoslovakian state, was a multinational state. It was in miniature what the Austrian Empire had been on a vast scale before 1914. That is, there were at least 4 or 5 different nationalities living there. And there was one nationality playing a key role, and this was the Czechs. They lived in the area called Bohemia, Moravia, also in the neighbor area of Prague. And they were the dominant nationality. But in addition, there were the Slovaks in the Czech area, by the way. there were also the industries. The Czechs had an important heavy industry, coal and steel. They produced, for instance, their own weapons. The Slovak area was an area which was more agrarian. The Slovaks produced the food the Czechs needed. And even beyond, further to the east, the advanced eastern area of Slovakia was inhabited by the Ruthenians being cousins of the Ukrainians. Stalin, after World War II, will even cut this away and will incorporate it in the Ukraine. And on the southern border of Slovakia, there was a Hungarian minority. Nearly 500,000 Hungarians lived on the southern fringe of Slovakia. And I add even to the picture that there was also, even though it was not this kind of concentrated, compact group, there was a Jewish minority living there, but of course there were Jewish minorities living everywhere. Now, this being said, Hitler did now use the Sudeten minority for political purposes. The Sudeten Germans had amongst themselves a Nazi party. They had different parties, but one of these parties was a Nazi party. And the leader of this Nazi party was Konrad Henlein. Henlein, you spell it capital H-E-N-L-E-I-N. Capital H-E-N-L-E-I-N. Henlein. This individual Henlein was briefed by Hitler how he should act in order to create troubles, to the internal troubles to the Czech government. Hitler, for instance, would tell him that he should request from the Prague government, by the way, the head of government in Prague was Beneš. Beneš, B-E-N-E-S. B-E-N-E-S. Beneš was the successor of the first president of the French Republic. And I have a little question for the history majors amongst you. And also for another reason, because the first president of the Czech Republic had spent during World War I quite some time in the United States. He was a philosophy professor, and he had married an American woman. I thought, just out of your own national pride, that you would know this man. Who was the first president of the Czech Republic? Aha.
No,
Again, I catch you off guard.
I have no idea.
Who dares thinking about it? When we go to Prague, there will be also a question about the first president. He had a son. The son of the first president became Minister of Foreign Affairs and died mysteriously in 1948 when the communists did take over. The son's name was Jan. The father's name was Thomas. Who was it now? I keep wondering for which kind of sins I'm punished that way. Certainly not those of the past, because I am aware of any. Thomas Masaryk. I will not spell the name, you will look it up. It's in your books. Thomas Masaryk was the first president, and he died in 1935, and his successor had been groomed to take over from him, and that was Beneš. Beneš was the Czech president. Now, Henlein would begin making demands on the Prague. Yes.
Who was Henlein?
Henlein was the Nazi leader of these Sudeten German, the Sudeten Germans living in the Czech Republic, in the Czechoslovakian Republic, I should say. And so Hitler used him to create problems internally. So Henlein would request, for instance, from Benesch that the German language should be recognized on an equal level with the Czech language. And then afterwards that the Germans, the Sudeten Germans should be allowed a certain measure of self-administration. So each time when the Prague government had made one concession, he would step up his demands, ask more, and of course ultimately the Czech government could not agree. And in addition, he was staging demonstrations by the German minority against the Czech government. And in these demonstrations, there were violent clashes with the police. All this was, of course, staged purposely to create problems and clashes and to allow Goebbels to show, look how the Prague government is repressing and oppressing the German minority. So in other words, Hitler was acting on three levels. First, military, let the army prepare for the invasion. Second, terms of propaganda, fill the German public and world public opinion with reports about oppression by the German minority. And then thirdly, use internally this Nazi party leader Konrad Henlein to create problems for the Czech state. Now, when Benesch realized where Hitler was standing, and when he got reports that the German army was really, maybe not next day, but was in the foreseeable future, preparing an invasion, Benesch then thought the only way to wake up his allies, and his allies, the French were his allies, the British were on his side, and also wake up world public opinion by making a sensational decision. So he, in May 1938, Benesch decreed the mobilization of the Czech army. Now, the mobilization of an army means that there is an impending danger of war. And Benesch did it in order to produce a reaction on the part of the French and of the British. And at the same time, and because he justified this by reports of his intelligence agency that the Germans were preparing an invasion. Now, Hitler, because he did not prepare this invasion for the next day, Hitler flew into a rage, denying any such plan, which was of course a lie, because he had given the order, but it was not for the immediate action. So Hitler violently denied it and accused Benesch of being a warmonger. And then the French, instead of telling Hitler, now you better stay quiet now because the Czechs are our allies, the French, on the contrary, went back at Benesch. The French said, are you crazy to provoke Hitler? In other words, Benesch found himself in the wrong position. That instead of being the future victim, he was now all of a sudden presented by the French as if he were the troublemaker. Whereas the real man preparing the showdown was Hitler. And so the war perspective, let's say the violent perspective of a clash, came closer. The tension was rising, Goebbels was getting more and more violent in his attacks against the Czechs, and in the summer the situation got really dangerous, particularly as Hitler, in September, he had the Nuremberg rally. Nuremberg is a city in southern Germany where the Nazis had every year a great political rally. Hitler staged this usually like a Wagnerian drama. And a movie was even made about this party rally. This movie was made by a famous, let's say, woman director, Leni Riefenstahl, who lived until, I think she died only maybe 10 years ago. She died well in her 90s. So Hitler used now this Nazi rally to make a violent speech against Benesch and to say that he would no longer tolerate this. So in other words, it became evident that there would be a showdown in the near future. So far for the origins of what will become the Munich Conference. And now we get to the events. When this danger of imminent showdown seemed to have reached a pitch point, the British Prime Minister, Neville Chamberlain thought it was time that he did something in order to save peace. So Neville Chamberlain decided to go and see Hitler. And for the first time in his life, he took the airplane and flew down to Munich to meet Hitler in Berchtesgaden. Now, of course, Hitler could not refuse to see Chamberlain. And so what was not Hitler's surprise when Chamberlain came to him and told him that he understood perfectly well what Hitler was aiming at least Chamberlain imagined that he had understood this, that he imagined that Hitler wanted to annex, to get those 3.5 million Sudeten Germans join Germany. Because this is something I must say about Chamberlain, in order to allow you to understand a little bit better in what kind of a world this man lived. Chamberlain had been under the former Prime Minister by the name of Baldwin. Chamberlain had been Minister of Finances, the head of the Exchequer. And Chamberlain had only one obsession: to allow England to get out of this economic crisis, which England had, gotten into from 1929 on. And Chamberlain's idea was that Hitler was a traditional nationalist, that Hitler was frustrated because Germany did not get, after World War I, Austria, where German-speaking people lived, and that Germany did not get what it also had wanted, the Sudeten Germans. So Chamberlain imagined that Hitler just wanted to get those German minorities join Germany. But, first of all, he was wrong, because Hitler was not a traditional nationalist. Hitler was a National Socialist expansionist, a man who had envisioned the conquest of living space. So, in other words, he was totally wrong on Hitler's ultimate goal. And Chamberlain also betrayed the traditional British foreign policy approach, because England had, from the days of Queen Elizabeth on, over the days of the Great Pitt, over the days of Queen Anne, they had always, and even until Napoleon, and then until World War I, the British had always followed with a keen eye the balance of power on the continent. Each time when one continental power threatened to impose its own domination on all the others, the British came out against it, joined others in order to prevent one power to get a dominant position on the continent. And so Chamberlain was unaware that if Hitler was allowed to annex Austria and the Sudeten Germans, that the increase in population, in weight and in power would upset the balance of power in Europe. Germany would then become the absolute number one, with all the consequences this might be. But in disregard of this, he thought that Hitler's aim was to get those Sudeten Germans. He had not read, neither he nor his close advisors, that he meant to destroy Czechoslovakia. So when he came, so parenthesis closed, when he came to see Hitler, he told Hitler, I understand you, you might have your Sudeten Germans. As far as I'm concerned, I'm willing to let you have them if I succeed in convincing the French and the Czechs, after all, to come along. If this way we can fulfill your expectations and peace will be preserved, it should be all right. Now Hitler was taken by surprise because he did not expect this kind of an offering. So that was the first surprise. And secondly, he did not want the Sudeten Germans as the only thing. He wanted to destroy Czechoslovakia, but of course he could not admit this to Chamberlain. So Hitler would say, okay, if that is so, then all right, then we might see peace might be preserved. And so Chamberlain said, oh, I am quitting you. I will fly back to London, get in touch with the French and get in touch with the Czechs. And if they agree with my proposal, I will come back and see you and we will fix then a deal and peace will be preserved. And so Chamberlain left. That was I think it must have been the 15th of September. He left, flew back to London. In London, he invited the French to come. And then afterwards the Czechs. And the French Prime Minister, we know him, at least some of you know him, because he also became an inmate of the concentration camp of Buchenwald. We did already meet in Buchenwald the French Prime Minister Léon Blum, who was head of the French government during the days of the Popular Front. This man here was head of the French government in the days of Munich. I have a big candy. Who will tell me the name of this French Prime Minister?
Was it Clemenceau?
No, Clemenceau, that's World War I, that was at the end. It's
Daladier.
Yes, Daladier. This is the second time that you save the honor of a whole group. It is Daladier, Edward Daladier. So Daladier came to London. And Daladier, he was they would call him the Gascon Bull. Yeah, that was his surname. Gascon he came from the southwest of France called Gascony. And Bull because he had a very loud, impressive outside appearance. When it came to action, he was, I would say, rather a rabbit, a discreet rabbit. But in the first place, he played the bull. So he went to London, and both agreed that this was the way to preserve peace. And when the two agreed, when Daladier joined Chamberlain, because after all, the British did not have a formal alliance with the Czechs, but the French had. The French had a formal military and political alliance, and they were supposed to come out for the defense of Czechoslovakia. So they invited then Beneš to come to London. And when Beneš came to London, he was exposed to blackmail by his friends and allies, because they made it clear that if he disagreed, and even as a result of this disagreement, if a war would break out with Hitler, then he would be responsible. Now you can imagine, with such kind of friends and allies, he certainly did not need Hitler. So ultimately, Beneš had no other choice but to agree to this kind of a crummy deal which Chamberlain was preparing. And once Beneš agreed and flew back to Prague, practically totally depressed, Chamberlain then did take the airplane again, and to come and see Hitler. This time Hitler at least made an outward gesture that he came halfway to meet Chamberlain. Now halfway, do not imagine that he came to Holland or to Belgium. He came to a neighbor city of Bonn. Bonn, everybody knows it, B-O two ends. Bonn became the German capital after World War II for 40 years when Germany was divided. Close to Bonn is a place called Godesberg. Godesberg is to be considered as a kind of a suburb of Bonn. So Chamberlain flew to Godesberg and Hitler came up to meet him there. But that was the only gesture Hitler made. Once they met and Chamberlain came and said, look, the deal is perfect. They agree to let you have the Sudeten Germans. Hitler said, I'm sorry. Meanwhile, the situation has evolved. This is not sufficient any longer. My new request is that the Czechs get out of this whole area in 10 days. And if they don't do it, then we'll go to war. Now, Chamberlain was taken aback because these were new requests. This is not what they had agreed when they departed a week earlier. And so Chamberlain said, well, look, this is something new. Neither the French nor the Czechs have agreed to this.
Did he demand that the Czechs get out of the Sudetenland or out of?
Out of the Sudetenland, out of this area which he would delimit. But it was still something which had not been agreed, and Chamberlain could not commit himself to this. So Chamberlain said, okay, if that is the way you see it, then I'm afraid this would mean probably war. And so he left Godesberg on 23rd. He flew back to London. And by that time, world public opinion seemed to be preparing that there would be this ultimate showdown. And in both countries, in France and in England, mobilization plans, at least war decisions were taken to prepare the country for a war which seemed to be impending. But then Chamberlain, of course, was totally unhappy and could not resign himself to the fact that despite of his original effort that war would come. So he looked for a means to avoid the confrontation. And the means he thought he had found was to turn to Mussolini. He turned to Mussolini and asked Mussolini to take the initiative and organize a four-power conference in Vienna in order to preserve peace. And Mussolini, of course, he was surprised and delighted because Mussolini had been left out. He had played no role so far, or he had had the bad role for what he had done in Ethiopia and for what he was doing in Spain. Mussolini all of a sudden felt that he was now again a European actor. So he turned to Hitler and also to Daladier and said, well, why I invite you to come to Venice, that we talk about this Czech venture. Now the one who was now badly taken by surprise was Hitler. Hitler was furious because Hitler had really meant that this would be the opportunity to settle accounts with the Czechs, to go to war. But he could not turn down Mussolini. Mussolini was his partner, his ally. And so, grudgingly, he had to accept Mussolini's offer. But he added two more elements. He said, no, I won't come to Venice, you come to Munich. And you come to Munich next day. In other words, Hitler increased now the pressure. Munich the day afterwards. And Mussolini passed this message on then to the two others, to Chamberlain and to Daladier, and everybody was now, getting ready, beginning to travel to join Munich the next day. I do not know how Daladier made it. He might have taken the train or the airplane. Chamberlain again took the airplane. Mussolini, who had a common frontier, and he was not far away from Munich, only a couple of hours, he took the train off to Munich. And on the frontier, when he crossed from the Italian border into Germany, into Bavaria, Goering stepped on his train. And Goering had with him a map with plans which were practically the same request which Hitler had shown to Chamberlain when Chamberlain had come to meet him in Godesberg. That is, that the Czechs would have to get out in 10 days and that Germany would be allowed to occupy this. And that Germany would be allowed also to trace the new borders. And Goering gave this plan to Mussolini, so Mussolini should take them out as if this were his compromise plan in order to save peace. In reality, the plan was drawn up by Hitler. And so when they met then on the 28th in Munich, Mussolini, Mr. Good Office, did take out this plan, and everybody agreed to this. So in Munich, 4 were present: Hitler, Mussolini, Chamberlain, and Daladier. Nobody was there from Russia, even though Stalin had also a treaty with the Czechs. And the Czechs themselves were also absent. So in other words, the 3, I leave Mussolini aside, the French and the British, they put their signature under a document which had been previously reached over to Mussolini and which ultimately amounted to nothing else but a concession to Hitler's blackmail. Hitler had what he wanted, at least at the meeting of Godesberg. It was a shameful surrender by the Western democracies to Hitler's blackmail.
If it was the same plans that Hitler had already shown Chamberlain before, didn't he realize that? Like,
Well, there might have been maybe differences in vocabulary, but it amounted to the same. And Chamberlain, he, as the French agreed to this, Chamberlain thought that this was a price they would have to pay in order to preserve peace. This is precisely what will be called later on, this is the last time that this did stick, Chamberlain's appeasement policy, appeasement of the dictators. Now, so in other words, this is the event which entered the annals of Western European history, of the history of the democracies, of a shameful surrender to the blackmail of a dictator. Now, I open a parenthesis here. You know, that this was used, this surrender of the democracies before the blackmailing of a dictator, this was used by your president, George Bush II, in order to prepare the American public opinion and world public opinion for the invasion of Iraq. Because it was considered Saddam Hussein was practically put on the same level that if we don't do it then, we will ultimately end up like the Western democracies did as they gave in to the blackmailing of the dictator. So you see that Munich did play a role even in later history, as it was used for good or bad reason, as an example of how not to act. Now, Chamberlain stayed behind one more half a day longer. And so he had a meeting with Hitler. And he made Hitler sign a document in which Hitler pledged himself that he would openly declare that he had no other territorial claims.
Who stayed?
Chamberlain made Hitler sign. This after Daladier had already left. So Chamberlain stayed a little bit longer and had a meeting on the Four Eyes with Hitler and made him sign this document that he had no further territorial claims. And when they returned home now, Daladier to Paris, Daladier was afraid. When I think he came by airplane, and when he entered then Paris to the center of the city, he was afraid that the Parisian population might greet him with stones and with boos, and that he might be taken apart by French public opinion. But the Parisian population gave him a standing ovation as a man who had saved peace. And Daladier was so taken by surprise that he whispered to the man who was close to him, "Those idiots, they do not know what we did." So at least, cynically, he knew what he had done, even though the public opinion was unaware of it. And when Chamberlain now stepped down, a little bit later from his plane, some of you might have seen the picture in the movies, in documentary movies. He stepped down from the plane, had this sheet of paper, which Hitler had signed, in his hand, waving it. It was symbolic, but ironic. He said, "This is peace for our time." That's what Chamberlain said. For Hitler, this paper was just a shred of paper. So, in both countries, the two were in the first place celebrated as if they had saved peace. What were now the consequences of this Munich agreement? First, Beneš, the Czech president, Beneš was so disgusted and so disappointed that he resigned in protest. He resigned in protest and left his country, abandoning the country to a successor who was a pale man who had no stature by the name of Hacha, H-A-C-H-A. H-A-C-H-A. Hacha became Beneš's successor. Beneš went into exile, strangely enough, to the country which had left him down, to London, where he will spend the next years until the end of World War II. That is the first thing. Germany, Hitler had the German army enter 10 days later. They entered this area, occupied the Sudeten territory, but not only the territory where Sudeten Germans lived. They were so generous for themselves, tracing the new borders, that 800,000 Czechs were included in the new territory which the Germans did take over. And they called this territory Protectorate. It became a protectorate provisionally. Well, the name will be given later on to the whole of Bohemia. They occupied it, and that was it. It was for Hitler, it was very important, because 4.5 million, plus the Czechs, he could not mobilize the Czechs, but 4.5 million more Germans meant that the German army had now even a greater reservoir for recruiting troops. But what was more interesting was that in this area of Czechoslovakia are located the Czech war industries, the ammunition factories. So this fell into German hands, which was of course a bonanza for him. That was not all. Hitler remained convinced after the surrender, after the concessions at the moment of the Rhineland occupation, after the concessions over Austria, that he could continue to gamble, that the Western democracies were corrupt to the bones, and that he could continue in his future planned violations of other territorial clauses of the Versailles Peace Treaty. And by the way, he immediately gave orders to prepare for settling accounts what was left of Czechoslovakia. That was not all. Hitler encouraged the neighbors of Czechoslovakia to present similar kind of territorial claims to the Czech government. So he encouraged the Poles to request the return of an area which is called Teschen, capital T-E-S-E-N. It is a very small area where a population speaking Polish lived. And the Poles were blind enough, unaware that they would be next, that they forced the Czechs to give up the territory. In other words, the Poles did not show themselves from their best side, the least we can say. They acted like Hitler. They forced the Czechs to give up the territory. And I would like to warn you, our guide, which we will have, I tried to figure out when we went there the first time, how she felt about it. The least we can say that the Polish historiography does not see it that way. The Poles consider that this was a territory which was inhabited by Poles and which they should recuperate. In reality, coming after Hitler's blackmail, what they did was another blackmail towards the Czech government. But that was not all. Much more important was the blackmail coming from Hungary. The Hungarian government requested that a whole stretch of territory situated in the southern part of Slovakia should be turned back to them. And this was a much more important stretch of territory, with nearly 500,000 Hungarian-speaking people, which would be cut off from the area on the southern part of the territory where the Slovaks lived. And Hitler will also encourage the Slovak autonomist, the Slovak independentist movement, that is Slovak separatism. The Slovaks felt from earlier days on somehow exploited and treated as minor junior partners by the Czechs. So in other words, this Hitler encouraged the boost this gave to the Slovak separatism. That is not all. Stalin, who had not been invited, Stalin started thinking about an alternative to his pro-Western policy, to the policy trying to find a common ground with the Western democracies against Hitler. Because Stalin slowly came to the conclusion, unlike what Hitler thought, that the attitude of the Western democracies was not due to any kind of appeasement, any kind of cowardice, any kind of corruption, but that this was an voluntary, an intentional policy to unleash Hitler against him. So in other words, Stalin was thinking about finding an alternative to avoid a too early confrontation with Hitler. So in other words, Hitler had every reason to be satisfied, and that was not all. There was an additional consequence which nobody was aware of, but which might have had which would have changed the evolution had the Western democracies been courageous enough to stick to their alliance, particularly the French, to stick to their alliance and come out in defense of Czechoslovakia. Because General Beck, remember what I told you about General Beck? He had been the chief of staff of General Fritsch. And General Beck, who was already, looking on what to do to make a coup against Hitler's rule in Germany. There was a conspiracy on the part of these generals who were convinced that the Western democracies, that France and England would go to war, would come to the rescue of the Czechs. And in that case, the generals planned a military coup against Hitler. In that case, they would arrest Hitler and take over. But as there was no such a war, that the French and the British bowed down and gave in. So this planned coup fell flat. And Hitler was not even aware the danger he had escaped. So in other words, the whole thing passed the world had come to the brink of war because Hitler had gambled. And the gamble had only worked because the Western democracies had been cowards, had given in. The public opinion, nonetheless, in the Western world, which was anxious to stay in peace, in the first place, this public opinion acted as if now peace was preserved, that now, from now on, things would turn back to normal. But they will very quickly be disillusioned, because about 6 weeks after these events, another event did shake up the public opinion in Germany and also in the rest of the world, because at that time the Hitler regime in Germany showed its true face, its true aim. It was the Reichskristallnacht. The Reichskristallnacht, that is, it is a name given by the Nazis because it was a gigantic pogrom which the Nazis organized on the 9th of November 1938 against the Jewish population in Germany. It was a huge pogrom of a magnitude which nobody had even imagined. And about 200 people were killed, savagely assassinated, others mutilated, others arrested, we'll see. And the name comes from the broken glass of the Jewish stores. The Jewish synagogues went up in flames. Therefore, the name Reichskristallnacht. Now, this event has its place in the road towards a final solution. But as the road towards a final solution goes parallel to the road to the war, I make an exception and therefore tell you a little bit about this Reichskristallnacht, which we will then not have to repeat when we switch over to the road to the final solution. What happened now? What happened that this pogrom did take place? We will again proceed the same way as I used to. Origins, why? And then events, and then the consequences. Because the consequences, the reason why I mention it, the consequences will also bear into the attitude of the world public opinion and European public opinion towards Germany and towards the future and towards the perspective of an upcoming war. Now, first of all, the origins. The origins had to do that Hitler proceeded in his road towards a final solution step by step. First, when he did seize power, when he launched the first anti-Semitic movement. Then afterwards, when he became president of the Republic, when there was nobody to check him, that he could give open rein to his anti-Semitism, and this came out, it's the year after he became Führer in the Nuremberg racialist legislation of September 1935. We'll come back to that. Now, after the Olympic Games were over and after he had already proceeded to the annexation of Austria and now to the annexation of the Sudeten Germans, the perspectives that war might be coming moved closer. And so Hitler felt that there had also to be an additional push in the direction of the final solution. So in other words, a showdown had to be produced with the Jewish population and with an increase of anti-Semitic implementation of policies in Germany. This was the general context. Now there was one precise pretext he did take to unleash this pogrom. The pretext was the following. The Nazis were, in relationship to their racialist legislation, the Nazis had decided in September, October 1938 that the Polish Jewish population, that is, I should say, the German Jewish population, which had entered Germany, coming from Poland, after 1918, after Poland had occupied a number of territories where Germans had lived. There were German-speaking Jews who lived in these territories. There were tens of thousands. They left Poland and emigrated into Germany. Now, Hitler in
What year was that? Or what?
1918, 1919, after World War I. Now, Hitler, in the tightening of his anti-Semitic policy, he decided that these immigrants, which lived in Polish territory, that they would be kicked out of Germany. They were not given recognition of their German citizenship. They were told, well, look, you came 20 years ago, we'll drive you back to Poland. We will kick you out and you'll have to go back to Poland. And in Poland, and this is important, in Poland there lived a Jewish population of more than 3 million. And in Poland, in the interwar period, there was a strong anti-Semitic climate prevailing. This has to be known. So the Polish government refused to accept these Jews coming from Germany. So in other words, what happened now was the Germans pushed them beyond the border. Now, the situation was the following. The German and Polish borders, or the German and Polish police and customs offices were not side by side. There was a no man's land between the German customs and the Polish customs. And this no man's land was in a forest which was practically 1 or 2 miles wide. So what happened was that these people, and they were elderly people, they had entered Germany 20 years earlier, they were kicked out, and the Poles refused to let them in. So they stayed, this was now in October, November, they stayed now in the middle of an early coming up winter in an area without shelter, just living in the woods. So in other words, they were in total abandonment. Now, amongst those Polish, German Jews, were the parents of a youth, of a Jewish youth, by the name of Greenspan. Now, you look the name up in Davidovich. Don't spell it the same way than the chairman of the Fed, because I have always surprised how often I meet his name. Greenspan, Herschel Greenspan, it's a Jewish spelling, nothing in common with, what's his first name? Alan. No family whatsoever. So, this Herschel Greenspan, Polish youth, when he heard that his parents were amongst those, he had been in Paris, he wanted to punish the Nazis, to make a coup. So he planned to kill the Nazi ambassador in Paris. And so when he came to the embassy, he badly wounded, not the ambassador was not there, but the third counselor of the German embassy, who, to make it worse, was not even a Nazi, was secretly an anti-Nazi, by the name of von Rath, R-A-T-H. Now, this von Rath, he was badly wounded and he died 2 days later from the wounds. When this became known now, that this Polish youth had done this, Hitler decided it was about the time when he went to Munich to celebrate his famous Munich Putsch of 1923. So he was in Munich when the news came that Rath was dead. It was at the eve of this celebration, and Goebbels was around. So Hitler passed the word to Goebbels that he should take advantage of this to unleash then the pogrom, a gigantic pogrom as a kind of reprisal for this assassination of the third council of the embassy by this Polish youth. Goebbels made the speech, and for the last time, the SA were present. The SA, which had paid very dearly, remember, on June the 30th, 1934, Goebbels made now a speech to the SA and practically incited them to go after the Jews and act as if this were a spontaneous outbreak of anger against the Jewish population, against the Jewish synagogues, the Jewish stores, and so on. And so they went out on a rampage. And it was really a rampage which ended up with the assassination of at least 200 people, the wounding and mutilation of so many others, the going up in flames of stores and of synagogues. That was one facet of this night of the broken glass. There will be a second reaction. The second reaction was the reaction of the SS. Himmler and Heydrich, and you find it when you study very seriously what you have in Fest. Himmler and the SS, they were not present at that time in Munich, and they resented this wanton destruction of property goods. But of course, they felt that they had to do something if they wanted to stay in Hitler's favors. So what they did now, they added now to it. Himmler gave the order, we do not know whether it was him or Heydrich, to arrest the 20,000 richest, wealthiest Jewish citizens, to arrest them and throw them into the concentration camps, with the possibility that they might be liberated if they left Germany and abandoned all their properties to the SS. So this was the second blow. The arrest of the 20,000 wealthiest Jews, with the possibility that the SS might inherit, between quotes, their properties. If they, and most of them they did, they abandoned their goods and tried to, and got out. And that was not all. Then there was a third Nazi who felt that he needed to show Hitler how a convinced anti-Semite he was. And that was Goering. Goering now, as the head of the 4 years plan, he decided to apply a punishment to the Jews, because Goering pretended that the Jews were responsible for these disorders. So he fined them to pay a fine of 1 billion Reichsmark. That was one thing. In addition, he forced them to pay out of their own pockets the destructions which had been made to their properties, to their stores and to their houses and so on. And in addition, he forced the Jews to turn over the insurance money they might have gotten for the destructions, to turn this money over to him. So in other words, this Reichskristallnacht had these three facets, but of course the most appalling one was the rampage, this kind of pogroms, this assassination of so many people. Now, which were the consequences of this? The consequences, and here we return again to foreign policy. If world public opinion had been, or at least the European public opinion, had believed a short moment or a few days and weeks after Munich that peace was preserved, that this was peace for our time, as Chamberlain had claimed, this opened the eyes now to the public opinion. From now on, public opinion in France and in England and elsewhere became aware, even before their own government, that sooner or later a war would come with this Nazi regime, which had such a hideous face and which did not shy away to persecute in this way a minority which could not protect itself. So in other words, from now on, the European public opinion knew that sooner or later war would be unavoidable. So far for the importance of this event. Next now, Hitler prepared the next move, and this was the final blow to what was left of Czechoslovakia. Again, this final blow will be known under the name of Coup of Prague. The Coup of Prague is the military occupation of the Czech capital by the German army on the 15th of March 1939. The same as we said, the Munich conference, September 28th, 29th, 1938. This is the Coup of Prague, March 15th, 1939. Now, Hitler proceeded again on three levels. First of all, the army got the order to get ready for the final blow in military terms. That is one thing. Secondly, Hitler and Goebbels, they again multiplied in the German media's reports on mistreatment of this time not German minorities, but of individual Germans in this Czech, what was left of a rump Czech state. So in other words, that here the Czechs would not now stop persecuting innocent Germans who lived in their midst. Then the third element was internal. The way he had used Henlein to try to break up the Czech state from inside, now he used the man who was the leader of the Croatian independentist movement. And this is the leader of this Croatian independentist movement was a Catholic priest. And this Catholic priest's name was Tiso. T-I-S-Z-O. Tiso. Monsignore Tiso. Hitler let Tiso in early March come to Berlin. And he told Tiso that he should proclaim unilaterally the independence of Slovakia from the Czech state, that they should simply declare their independence.
Wait, you said the leader of the Croatian independence movement.
The independence of Slovakia. Did I say Croatia?
Yeah, Croatia.
Horrible. I feel ashamed for
It's
the rest of the
Friday.
day.
It's Friday.
I put ashes on my head now. Because this is something which should under no circumstance have happened. No, the independence of Slovakia. The independence of Slovakia. So he proclaimed this independence, and then, March the 14th, Hitler invited the Czech president, Hascha, to come to Berlin. And Hascha in Berlin got this, he was not invited to come to Berchtesgaden, but to come to the German capital. He got about a treatment in Berlin like Schuschnigg had gotten it in Berchtesgaden a year earlier. So Hascha was told by Hitler that if he would not sign a request demanding on the part of Hitler and of Germany to send the German army in order to preserve peace, if he would not sign such a demand, then the German Air Force would bomb Prague and would level the capital, and more precisely the Rachin, that is the main hill where the palace of the president is located, plus all the fortress and so on. Now, Hascha was so terrorized that at a given moment he fainted. So they had to bring in doctors to give him a shot so that he would recover consciousness, that he could sign this document. So he ultimately signed the document on March 14th, and the day afterwards the German army moved in. The Czech army did not react because they had not the slightest chance. So the German army occupied Prague, and what was left of rump Czechoslovakia, Slovakia became independent, the independence was recognized by Germany, but the new Slovak government, headed by this Monsignore Tiso, invited the German army to occupy military bases in Slovakia. So in other words, Slovakia became in fact a German satellite, and the German army could occupy military bases in this so-called new independent state, which was nothing else but a German satellite. What was the reaction on the part? How did Chamberlain take this? In other words, which will be the consequences of this? The consequences, of course, were dramatic, were far-reaching. First of all, Chamberlain ultimately recognized that, first of all, he was totally wrong by imagining that Hitler was a traditional German nationalist. Because by annexing now what was left of Czechoslovakia, this was a non-German population. And Hitler even transformed this territory. He did not annex it as such to Germany, unlike what he had done with the Sudeten or what he had done with Austria. He set it up as a protectorate of Bohemia, Moravia. And the first protector of this new state became his former Minister of Foreign Affairs, Neurath. Neurath was nominated protector, ruling governor, you could say. In reality, he was, just a name's sake. The Nazis had their own representatives running this new state. So, Chamberlain realized that he was wrong, but nonetheless, he did not live up to his immediate consequences, because in his immediate consequences, he and the French would have had to come out now and declare war on Germany for violating the Munich Agreement. He did not. The French will follow him. And he had an incredible explanation why he did not declare war on Germany. He said, in the British Parliament, we ensured the integrity of an existing country. And we do stick to this insurance. But, he said, this country does not exist any longer. So in other words, we do not have to come out to fight for a country which is gone. So in other words, our insurances are not valid for a country which does not exist any longer. So after this cynical explanation why he did not come to the rescue, why England and France did not declare war, he nonetheless now did draw the conclusions. He now, first of all, decided that England should make the necessary war preparations for an impending war. And he gave now full military insurances to 3 countries in Eastern Europe whom he felt were directly threatened by this aggressive stance of Germany. And these 3 countries were, of course, in the first place, Poland, Romania, and Yugoslavia. But the most important of the 3 was Poland. The Polish government was given full assurances that in case of a military confrontation, in case of a German violation of its borders, of its sovereignty, that England would go to war. That is not all. The other consequences of this were that Hitler now practically could get all the war equipment of the Czech army, because the Czech army was one of the best, one of the most modern. So particularly the artillery and the tanks, they could be just taken over by the German army, and including all other war factories which still existed in not yet occupied Czech territory. So in other words, the Germans got a tremendous boost now in terms of war preparations in the future. Yes?
Did the Czech army ever fight back when the Germans invaded?
No. The Czech army, understanding its full hopelessness, would not act.
Okay.
No orders came out in this sense. And Hitler again now considered that the Western democracies were cowards and that he could continue in his drive, and the next target was already in view, and that will be Poland. So he was convinced that the democracies corrupt to the bones would not act. But more important is that he had now, through the occupation of Czechoslovakia, such an increase in strength and in power that he was not intimidated any longer by the Western democracies. In other words, that they did not, when they threatened him, this would not impress him any longer. So in this regard, the situation was extremely problematic, but that was not all. When you look on a map now, when he occupied now Bohemia, Moravia, plus the Slovak territory, if you look on the map, then you will see that this meant this whole southern side of Poland, the Polish southern border, was now occupied by the German army. So in other words, Poland, militarily speaking, for the future showdown, Poland was now surrounded on three sides by the German army, north, west and south. In other words, Poland through this found itself, in militarily speaking, in a desperate situation. It was as bad, if not worse, as Czechoslovakia after the annexation of Austria. It was one domino was falling after the other, and that the Poles would be next, there would be no doubt, even though Goering had again assured them that they had nothing to fear, of course nothing to fear. But that was not all. There was another consequence, and that was Stalin. Stalin now came to the conclusion that the Western democracies were purposely pushing Hitler against him. And so he decided that he would turn the tables around against them. Then instead of allowing the Western democracies to unleash Hitler against him, he would unleash Hitler against them. So in other words, he decided to change his foreign policy by 180 degrees, to come to make a deal with Hitler. And he gave clearly a sign that he was preparing to do that. He dismissed his Minister of Foreign Affairs, Litvinov, whom he had appointed 5 years earlier, in 1934, to work for an alliance with the Western democracies. And he was Jewish. So in other words, by dismissing this Jewish Minister of Foreign Affairs and by appointing his right-hand man, Molotov, he gave Hitler an open symbol sign that he was willing to deal with him. And the anti-German, anti-Nazi propaganda in the Russian media stopped at once, whereas now came anti-capitalist media propaganda. And when the Communist Party had their Congress, it was a Congress after the purges and after the terror in the spring of 1939, when the speeches were made, no word was said against Hitler Germany. So in other words, Stalin gave a clear sign that now he did not trust the democracies any longer, that he was willing to make a deal with Hitler. Whereas Hitler, on his side, as he was convinced that he had gotten away with Austria, he had gotten away with Czechoslovakia, even in two stages, first Munich, then Prague, he now fixed his perspective on his next victim, Poland. So we stop here. We'll see how the last preliminary was developing and how this last preliminary did lead into a war which Hitler did not expect and which he did not want, but which triggered off ultimately World War II.